So, here's the spoon that I was carving. Notice that I bagged it up while I was waiting for the other video to upload to YouTube. So now it still has that moisture on the skin. If you don't bag it up, it only takes a few minutes before the top surface gets dry enough that it becomes a real chore to deal with. So, here it is. I have now, did I do the top? So I need to do the top rim. Looks like I did a little bit, but I need to do a little bit more. So this is where those weird pivot cuts come into play, so that you can see the line that you're carving. So this method, with some alterations, is the method that I use for carving all of my different forms. And I do so because it just makes sense. So now I can look down this handle and see that there's just a little too much material here. And that has to do with the fact that the grain changed a little bit, so it didn't carve quite evenly. So, there we go. Carving like this, where you're basically running perfectly parallel with the grain, is one of the trickiest things to do. But that just about did it. Notice that I'm being real finicky at this stage. This stage is the stage to get everything squared up and in line and nicely squared off, so that it's not wider back here than it is here, unless you want it to be. That can be a design thing. But now's the moment to get everything kind of dressed up and double checked that you've gotten it all exactly the way you want it. Okay, good. I can tell that I am too wide still on this side. But because this rim is quite thick, I'm going to shave it down a little bit on the back before I try to make that cut. I want this to be a thin rim so that I can make a nice controlled cut. If I tried to do that while the rim was still super thick, I would have struggled and I would not have ended up with as nice of a line as I want. Now, the other thing I'm going to try and do is reduce the angularity of these shoulders. That's one thing I've learned, is that it's easy to overdo these shoulders back here and have them be too steep of a curve. So part of what I'm doing here is trying to mellow out that curve. Good. And then good. And then we'll mellow out this curve on this shoulder here. Yeah, that's better. That's better. Just going to do just a smidge here. So every time you adjust the outline here, it's worth going back and double checking this curvature of the rim. Because when you push the line into this material that's higher, you're going to change the line of the rim. Now, you could spend a bunch of time getting the surface of the bowl either lightly hollowed out or just dressed so that it's flat. But that's a lot of time and effort and a lot of material to go across for something that, you know, takes just a couple seconds to clean up. So now I have the rim the way I want it. I've got the handle nicely dressed and lined up the way I want it. Looks like the back of the handle is not actually even. That side is fatter, so I think that can be adjusted best by doing that. Okay, good. Now I'm going to pull this rim up fairly tight, and then I'm going to blend it into the back. And because I'm going to do, one of the final steps is to do a much more thorough job thinning out the back. I'm not going to work too terribly hard in getting this perfect. Instead, I'm going to get it close and then call it good, because I know I'm going to come back to it. So until something is like the final time you're going to do it, there's no point in getting it absolutely perfect, because it's then going to be changed once you adjust some other feature. So each dimension, carving each dimension, whether it's the sides or the top, changes the other dimension, at least a little bit. And so that's why it's important to think of spoon carving as sort of slowly bringing something into alignment rather than trying to nail it right from the beginning. Because every time you adjust something, it changes the balance of the whole thing. Okay, so now I've got everything straightened, lined up the way I want it to be. So now I'm going to run my facets. I decided for this little batch of kid spoons that I'm doing to just do a simple, even facet on each of the corners and call that good. But to do a simple, even facet is not an easy thing to do. Notice that I'm using the tip to the middle of the blade, and my thumb is up on the middle of the blade there. And then what I found nice is once you do a facet like that, if you're going to leave it simple like that, is to soften it by taking off a little tiny chamfer on either side. Just the thinnest you can manage. So this is why it's important to get everything straightened out before you do your facets, because once you do your facets, if your facets don't fall on something that's already straightened and aligned, then it gets increasingly difficult to straighten it out once you've done your facets, because your facets essentially live on top of the surface below them. So this is why it's important to get everything square and even and aligned before you start knocking off any corners. Even though it will be tempting to knock off corners, because that's easy. But for the sake of the alignment and evenness of your finished spoon, try to resist. You can see how delicate a cut I'm taking off here. So it's just the tiniest little thing. It helps to start these cuts in letting the knife slide down from here to the tip, but in order to sustain such a cut, you either need to get the amount of sliding just right, or at a certain point you sort of end up at the tip just pushing with the tip instead of continuing to slide. Or you can just start at the tip and push. Either will work. Okay. Now you'll notice that I've waited to do the spoon bowl, and that's because it gives me options to leave the bowl until last. If I found a crack or I needed to adjust the shoulder or anything like that, by leaving all this material in the middle here, I can adjust this essentially an infinite number of times until I decide that everything is right. And as long as I leave that middle material in the bowl, I can make the bowl smaller and smaller and smaller, and thus adjust to whatever happens. Okay, now my handle is nicely chamfered and faceted. The back of the bowl is going to need more thinning out, but I'm going to do that after I do the inside of the bowl. The reason I do it afterwards is that the inside of the bowl is where you might need to go a little bit deeper in order to get it to feel just right. And if you do the outside of the bowl too perfectly, you might lose that couple millimeters of material that would give you the flexibility you might need on the inside to make it just right on the inside. You're also going to be looking for, particularly something like this that's going to go in someone's mouth, you're looking for it to feel just right on the inside too, as opposed to just eyeballing it, and then once it feels just right on the inside, then you make it feel just right on the outside, on your bottom lip, and you end up with a spoon that works much, much better that way. Okay, so I'm going to cover how I use the hook knife next week in the final VAC week. So I'm not going to go into much detail here, except to say that I start in the middle and I stay away from the edges, and I kind of creep up on the edges from all sides. So I don't let one side stay real chunky. I try to sort of work my way out to the edges from all sides. So whichever side is thickest, I'll work there next. And there's a bunch of different ways of using the hook knife. The main thing when using a hook knife is to make sure that you're cutting with the grain, that you're going downhill with the grain, or across it. And if the hook knife isn't, if you're not able to make a small, delicate cut with the hook knife, it means that you're trying to go uphill against the grain, and you need to stop and figure out a way to either come across the grain or go down from the opposite direction. And there's just sort of, once you figure out the handful of ways that you can make these cuts, you just kind of combine them and combine them and combine them. And it becomes sort of second nature to just sort of move around. Okay, I'm doing this one, I'm doing that one. There's not one set way that I always carve every spoon bowl. It's sort of the least programmed part of carving for me, because to some extent I am reacting to how the knife is behaving. It's definitely the trickiest part of carving is carving the bowl. So, but one thing that is true is that when I get to a place about here where the rim is relatively thin all the way around, you can see that? Right now, the rim is angled up from the outer edge, and it just doesn't look quite as good from there, right? There's that little bump right there, and it just, you can see it strongly from there. So what I'm going to do, sheathe my knife, is I'm going to take my sloyd and I'm going to use it to push down that inner edge of the rim so that the whole thing is flat from side to side. Now, it's important as you do this to make sure that it's pivot cut, and also to watch this back side and make sure that you're not cutting this back quadrant when you don't intend to be. But this is also your last moment to adjust and refine the rim, the line of the rim as you see it from the side here. Now when you get up into the shoulders, this can be tricky because right here is where the grain changes. So don't try to, there we go, don't try to exit out of that cut there because you're going to mess it up. Instead, come down to it from the other direction like that, and then you get a nice clean line. And then the trick is to match it on the other side. if you have lined up everything, gotten everything even before you get to this stage, it will be pretty easy to match because you're just doing the same thing from one side to the other side. But depending on whether you did a lot of adjustment here on the rim, you might need to sort of pay attention to that and what sort of adjustment you need to make on the opposite side. And you can hold it up and you can kind of hold it so that you can sort of see one rim versus the other, and that will go a long way towards telling you what you need to do. Okay. All right. There's often a little bump that happens right there because that's where you go from your first cut to making your second cut. And if you don't blend it just right, you'll end up with a little bump. So pay attention right in that zone there. Right in this zone here. There you go. This back shoulder portion. And when you look at it from there, it should look good. Very nice. And I'm just going to adjust my facets to make the top of this appear roughly semicircular. There we go. Good. All right. Now we go back to the hook knife, just taking off some little bumps here. Now we go back to the hook knife and we finish hollowing out the bowl. And just like how we did on the back, where we made the rim the right thickness and then we blended, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to start by going around this inner rim and getting the inner rim the right thickness. Now, I think it's a common thing for people to decide that they want to have their rim be perfectly even all the way around the spoon bowl, because that's how metal spoons are, right? They're stamped out of an even thickness of metal, so the way it gets flipped up on the edge, it's an even rim. But an even rim like that is not only is it very difficult to achieve, because every time you mess it up even a little bit in one spot, you then have to go adjust it all the way around, and so it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until it comes around to completely ruining the spoon and chasing that perfect rim. It also doesn't feel the best in your mouth. What I've found is that what feels the best in your mouth, for spoons that are going in your mouth, is to have a rim that is narrowest on the edges here, and then have it be a little wider here at the tip so that it's stronger, right? That's the thing that's getting the most contact. And then it can be sort of in between back here. But by having that rim that varies in width, it frees you from the need to have it be even all the way around. And it makes it so that all you're doing is you're trying to chase a nice line. Trying to have it taper nicely without any big jumps or bumps. And so again, I am I'm focusing just on the rim. Just on getting that rim exactly the width that I want. And again, that width is going to vary from point to point on the spoon bowl. And once I get the rim exactly how I want it, then I will start blending down into the center of the bowl. But I will take great pains to avoid coming right up to the rim again. So here's where I'm being finicky, because really what your eye sees, so there's two things. Your eye sees the rim. When you're looking at the spoon, what your eye sees is the crispness and smoothness of the rim. What your mouth feels when it's in use is not the rim, but the curvature inside. So you've got to focus on both. Wow, it is super windy outside. Okay. Good. Good. And so now I'm going to blend. And in particular, I'm going to pay attention to this front bit here to here, because that often is too flat in people's spoons. I think because it's an awkward cut to make, so they don't make it. Or they do a few too few of these cuts. So I'm using my thumb here to feel that curvature, and I'm also being careful to stay away from the rim. So if I'm starting a cut, I might start right up close to the rim, but I'm not trying to start right at the rim, because if you start right at the rim, you're going to be redefining that rim. It's going to get narrower and narrower and narrower. So I'm starting just a fraction of a millimeter back from the rim, and I'm feeling for the curvature. When I feel like I'm close, I put it in my mouth and try and get a sense of, usually here and here there's some bumps, because this is kind of an awkward cut here, which is how you smooth that. And then this is even more of an awkward cut, this side. Okay. And then as far as depth was concerned, you want to be careful not to make the bowl of your spoon too deep. You'll know it's too deep when you put it in your mouth and it feels too deep. That was a super helpful tip. I hope you all wrote that down. There we go. All right. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So now, you want to knock a little chamfer off this inner rim, the inner edge of the rim, because if you don't, you'll feel it here and here when you pull the spoon out of your mouth. It'll feel sharp. I used to do this with the tip of the Sloyd, but then I realized that I should really be doing it with the hook knife, because the hook knife is perfectly designed to make such a cut. You just use the hook knife to make this tiny little micro chamfer here and here. Okay, now we're almost done. What we need to do now is thin out the back of the bowl, and what we're searching for is for it to feel just right when we pull it out of our mouth. In these circumstances, the longer a cut you can make, the smoother the back of the bowl will be. You also need to have really good control over that cut so that you don't dive it too deep. If you dive it too deep, you'll go straight through to the other side. What I'm searching for is to have it be thickest right here and then taper as I go to the edge and taper as I go to the tip. There's also a grain change that happens here. You can actually see it defined by what is essentially these whale tails here. From on this side of things, you can go in this direction. On this side of things, you have to be going in the opposite direction, in that direction. So right at that transition there, you need to be paying close attention to make sure you don't split the wood by going too far back here and then pushing the knife into the grain because it will crack. And then how thin and delicate you can make this has a lot to do with your skill and experience. And I would say it's worth ruining a spoon or two to figure out just how far you can push it. Particularly if you have a spoon that already has something wrong with it and you were going to scrap it, maybe instead save it, get it to this stage, and just carve it into oblivion and test it along the way to see how thin and delicate you can make it and how that corresponds to strength. But again, if you leave the middle of the bowl, the center here, slightly thicker, you'll be amazed at how delicate you can make it towards the rim and still have it be strong, because the strength from that thicker part at the middle is radiating out to the rest of the spoon. Okay, once I have that the way I want it, I'm getting awfully close. And you'll notice how I'm also careful to be creating a nice thin even rim, but I don't want to go so far as to eliminate that rim. I need to maintain that rim, otherwise I lose my shape in this dimension. Yeah, that feels really good. So now I'm going to go on this side of things and just smooth this out a little bit. If I've done my homework, it shouldn't need much. Just a light going over to smooth it out as much as possible. And then there's this little bump right here. And that, I just want to support the spoon here against the base of my thumb and just shave it this way very delicately. Try and blend that curve from one to the other, and then blend those chamfers on the back there. Okay. Okay, there we go. Very nice. Okay, so now, I bet you thought you were done. Two more things need to happen. I think number one is we need to knock a tiny little chamfer off this upper outer edge, and then we need to knock a corresponding tiny little chamfer off this bottom edge here. And to some extent that has to do with how it feels in your mouth, but it has a lot more to do with durability, because a sharp corner like that is at risk of being damaged, much more so than a corner that's had a tiny little corner knocked off of it. And that damage can then spread. So it's worth taking the time to just do these tiny, 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 tiny little chamfers on that edge. And right here, as you're going from the widest part of the bowl up towards the tip, you have to be so careful, because you can split the bowl at that stage. If your knife is too shallow, you're actually going uphill in the grain. So your knife needs to be steep so that you're actually going around the grain this way. And then on the back of the bowl, there's less risk because of how the back is oriented vis-a-vis the grain. That from the widest point up to the tip of the bowl, that carries a certain amount of risk. You have to be very careful, very gentle, and pay attention. Okay. Good. 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 That is the finished spoon. There's a tiny little spot here that's just a little lumpier. kind of like when you do any like house painting, and you have a go with house painting, and you make a little mistake, and you think, "Oh, that's gonna haunt me, and I'm gonna notice it. It's gonna drive me crazy." And then it turns out that once you live with it for a couple days, you just don't notice it anymore. So, as you watch me being finicky about things, to a large extent, walking away from any mistakes you have before you ruin the spoon is a really important, valuable skill to develop, because it's going to help you save a whole bunch of spoons that nobody's going to notice the things that you notice, and you're not even going to notice them a couple days after you make it anyways. So, there's the spoon. You can see the amount of crank, which is the level from here up to there. I like to burnish my spoons and then polish them. You can burnish with a rock. You can burnish with the back of a spoon. A little pebble gets in here quite nicely. A bit of deer antler that you've sanded up to 3000 grit, not to remove all the bumps, but just to knock them back a bit. Or a porcelain pestle works quite well. I do sell these porcelain burnishers that I design that are basically a combination of the shape of the deer antler and the shape of the pestle. There's quite a long waiting list on these right now. I think it's several months at least.